Hey everyone, welcome to the Smart Economy Podcast, a production of neonewstoday.com. I'm your host, Dylan Grabowski. In this episode of the Smart Economy Podcast, I sat down and spoke with Andrew Lawrence, the CEO and co-founder of Censo. Censo aims to provide self-custody and private key management solutions for organizations to better manage and protect their digital assets that they hold. To differentiate itself from other solutions, Censo utilizes a biometric authentication scheme using mobile phones to provide additional security. In this conversation, Andrew and I discuss how he recognized blockchain's utility early on in 2012 when thinking back on his experiences with derivatives markets, the importance of focusing on open source development, and the immutability of information stored on-chain, how the glacial, bureaucratic pace of institutions might have been a blessing in disguise, Censo's outlook on which blockchain the market will use moving forward, and much more. Just a reminder, nothing said on this podcast is a solicitation to buy or sell any tokens, that nothing should be taken as financial advice, and that the host or guests may hold tokens discussed in any given episode. With that said, I really enjoyed chatting with Andrew, and I hope you enjoy the conversation too. Hey everyone, welcome to the Smart Economy Podcast. Today we're joined by Andrew Lawrence, the CEO of Censo. He and his team are building decentralized key management for organizational control. How are you doing today, Andrew?
Dylan, I'm great, and great to be on the podcast. A pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm very excited to kind of dig into your background and what you're working on now. So to kind of jump into the deep end, you have a really diverse background in financial markets. So can you just kind of give us a brief overview of what your story arc has been like throughout your career?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Thanks. So maybe I can start at present and work my way back a little bit. So as you mentioned, I'm the CEO and I'm also the co-founder at Censo. And interestingly, my other co-founder is Charlie Walden, who's the CTO here. And Charlie and I, unbelievably, have been together pretty much on for about 25 years, which I like to say it's a very fruitful partnership because between the two of us, we actually have a complete brain, it comes in very handy. But we also, fortunately, between the two of us, have had a number of successes, including two companies that have gone from garage to US IPO. And a third one, which is a FinTech that we did, which was called Longitude, where we re-engineered the way that derivatives markets work at the microstructure level. And we ended up selling that company to Goldman Sachs. And that company is currently operated by NASDAQ. And I encountered crypto way back in 2012. And without belaboring the details, when I first read the Bitcoin white paper, as I like to say, when I read it the third time and I finally understood it, mostly, I realized that there was a very powerful rhyme between how blockchains are organized and mutualize balances and credit, and how we mutualized market risk in this Longitude company that we sold to Goldman. And that sent me straight down the rabbit hole. And I thought to myself, if we had had an encodable blockchain at that time, but instead of teaming up, we teamed up with places like Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, global enterprises with this company Longitude, because we didn't have any credit, right? We were a tech company and they collateralized our transactions. And really, crazily enough, back in 2012, after I read the white paper, I said to myself, wow, if we had had an encodable blockchain, we could have just stamped these transactions into a blockchain. And that was, of course, 8 years before DeFi summer or anything of that nature. And so the truth be told is that idea back then was totally loony in some ways, but it was also a fascinating time in crypto because in 2013, I went out and met with a number of the core devs on the Bitcoin project to discuss modifying the protocol to allow things such as this. And back then, believe it or not, people were actually talking about doing things like that with the Bitcoin protocol. And of course, we know the story since then that hasn't been the case. And that got my interest. And then Charlie and I decided crypto was compelling enough. We were going to do a company in the space, and that led to Censo. So that was hopefully not too much, but kind of like my recent trajectory, I would say.
No, it sounds like you got into Bitcoin during a really interesting time, especially, I hope I'm not doxing you, but being based out of New York, there was a lot of activity that was going on in, the early 2010s, the late aughts. So were these like kind of pre-bit license days? Was there still just kind of an air of excitement? Were the core devs at the time open to outside feedback?
For sure. And by the way, I mean, I want to characterize my role here properly and not overemphasize it, right? I was on certainly very much on the periphery of any of those discussions. But to your point, I think, which is very important as you characterize it, the community was very open to those discussions and it was very, very small. And, I think the community now remains fascinated, the crypto community, but that back then it was really just kind of very unusual because it was so nascent, I would say.
So you kind of cut off your story arc, talking about the business that you helped build and then eventually sell, and that was very micro oriented. But prior to that, you also spent some time at Pantera Capital, which is famous for its macro perspective, and your time there was prior to the launch of its Bitcoin fund. So, what were the insights that you picked up at the macro level during your time at Pantera? And did those play any role into your aha moment for Bitcoin beyond the programmability you were just speaking about?
Yeah, sure, sure. Well, yeah, as you know, before crypto, Dan and I were partners at Pantera. And before that, I had a career on Wall Street doing, quantitative finance, market making, and things of that nature. Though Pantera was global macro fund at the time. And of course, one of the great experiences to live through was the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And as I think Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary at the time, said, it was pretty harrowing if you didn't happen to live through it. Even reading it doesn't do it justice. But Hank Paulson said in a private conversation, and I remember this well, he said, this would be really interesting if it weren't happening to me, which I thought was a great line. But certainly, I think those of us who grew up studying or trained or even formally understanding 20th century economic theory, and then confronting the global financial crisis and all what I would describe as the extraordinary measures that the government undertook in order to save the financial system. And I think it's not exaggerated that they did save the financial system, but all these taboos of what was acceptable and unacceptable behavior for policymakers were successfully, in real time, sort of just pushed and then pushed over the limit. And of course, that created a tremendous amount of unease in people who had been in these markets traditionally as to where it would end up. And I do think also led to some hardened philosophical positions on the role of government in the economy. And, I would say I'm in the softer camp on that. I have a pretty open mind to both policymaking as well as role of government. But I also am trained in classical economics as well. And so to some extent, the famous birth of Bitcoin in that environment, to me, is not a coincidence either, right? I mean, if the same code had been released 5 years earlier, it probably would have just died, right? And so, in the Genesis block, that famous Times of London article and everything. So I always like to say, no matter how, and this is just my personal opinion, no matter how remarkable you think the invention was, it's a miracle that it actually flourished the way it did. Now, other people have different opinions. They say it's inevitable because it's so brilliant, but I think I'm more of a realist. But it was this blending of some of my experience in traditional finance and thinking about, philosophically about government and economics and policy, combined with some of the stuff that I did in FinTech before that sort of drove me right into crypto. And I'm grateful because of all the stuff that I've done in my career, I would say crypto remains the most interesting thing.
That certainly backs up my stance as well. I left a previous career in the urban planning field to go into crypto full time in 2018 and haven't looked back since. There's always something new every day. I think it's funny that you touched upon the dichotomy of believing that the US government needed to step in to essentially bail us out of catastrophe in the financial crisis in 2008. And I've read Andrew W. Sorkin's book, which chronicled everything. So very fascinating to hear you talk about that, but also to recognize that this peer-to-peer protocol was something that was born of the times. So it's an interesting dichotomy you hold, where on one hand you recognize that there needed to be intervention, and on the other hand, it's kind of like a duh moment that this technology would be released at the time it did. So I'm curious then, since it sounds like and allow me to just generalize that maybe you were ahead of the boat on a majority of your peers that were working in financial traditional markets who might have scoffed or written off Bitcoin, particularly in its first few years when it was seen as a hyper speculative internet token that could only be traded on shady exchanges. What was it that kind of like clicked for you immediately? And I want to kind of like parlay this into the work that you're doing at Censo because Bitcoin is inherently something that requires self sovereignty and kind of digging into and understanding on your own. So, what was it from that perspective where people had to learn about holding this? And what was its sort of weight and significance compared to the other things you were seeing on Wall Street?
There's so much in there, and there's so much great stuff in there. Thanks. Firstly, I want to issue an admission, which is that someone approached me, an acquaintance approached me in 2010 with the white paper, and I have to say, in full disclosure, I completely dismissed him and told him to leave me alone because I had a day job and I had stuff that it was more important with real money. So not like I just had the light bulb go off immediately. And then, of course, in 2012, I revisited it and finally got a little smarter. And, if I could put it in, you cited really helpfully and highlighted some of the things that drove me towards crypto. But I think another thing that really away from that, which is very simple, which is important. And I think, my ex-partner, Dan Moorhead, has highlighted this on many, many occasions, particularly at that time, was that even if you thought there was a glimmer of hope that the Bitcoin project would succeed, the asymmetry in the outcomes was just, so tremendous. I can't even remember what the total market cap was at that time. I recall Bitcoin was trading at around $75 or so. So it was a pretty small number. And so if you've ever been in the markets, and I think you do have to be open to new ideas and thoughts, and also I think philosophically has to resonate with you somewhat, the project, which it did. But if you combine all of that with the fact that if you were and if you'll excuse the expression, you were a gambler in a prior life, the overall proposition would appeal to you. And also, I would say as well, I was very fortunate at the time that I had other professional, personal acquaintances who had a similar sort of take on things. That being said, I think there was a tremendous amount of resistance, and tremendous amount of resistance still remains, maybe somewhat diminished by the erosion of the years on people's egos with regards to this. But there was a tremendous amount of resistance that it was just a boneheaded thing to even be considering. And I'm going to say one more thing, and we can get more substantive talk about what we're doing, which is that the truth be told is when it comes to money is one of the greatest abstractions that has ever been invented by humanity. And it is also one of the most difficult for people to apprehend and comprehend. And it's faith-based, but it also has objective criteria as to why it should be good or not. And so it was very difficult, I think, early on in getting anyone who believed in the old system, even if they did not understand it, to buy into a new system. So those are some of my thoughts on just generally the questions you asked. And then with regards to some of the things that we're working on, so thank you for asking about them, they do surround and, they are motivated by not just the ideals of self-sovereignty and decentralization, but what we believe to be the necessity of implementing those tenets. Because, our belief is that absent that, this whole project is not going to succeed, because those are necessary elements of the marketplace and the ecosystem is how I would put it. If that, I don't know if that resonates with you or not, but that's kind of my opinion.
No, it totally does. And something I really wanted to pull on, and you did a great job on touching it, is the wrapping our head around what money is and the value, the transactions of value, and what media can be used to transact value. And I think this is a great kind of segue into what Censo is, because historically, no matter what civilization we're talking about, whether it's puka shells or gold or dollar bills, there's always been an entity that held on to these kind of media of value as they accrued. If we go back to like the dark ages, it was even food and wheat, right? You would have your farmers put wheat into the castle and then the castle would distribute it. So as time has gone on and just economic models and systems have become more robust and required more and more of these institutions that have provided custody for these various different media of value. Why is that important today? And how come this digital assets that have this inherent self-sovereignty, how come there need to be like entities like Censo that are providing these services for larger institutions? And maybe this is an opportunity to kind of like explain to our audience why an institution needs a custodial provider in order to manage its digital assets.
Sure. Maybe I could just wind it on back a little bit and go to first principles and answer that question before we discuss about what we're doing. So, what's interesting, as you noted, is that we have a system that has been set up that theoretically is decentralized and self-sovereign. However, as it turns out, as the system developed, in particular for organizations, which is the user base that Censo is concerned with, all organizations, virtually all organizations, used centralized service providers in order to manage their assets and their keys. And those service providers are either regulated custodians, non-regulated custodians, or providers of services like smart custody solutions like what are called MPC or multi-party computation solutions. And all of those solutions require a third party to control your keys or your key shards and run code that generally is code closed source, not open source, and also requires trusting those organizations, which seems like a complete, irony, and it actually is. So we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? And I think there are two reasons, in my mind anyway, that come to mind. The first one is really a simple one. It's a no-brainer, right? Regulations required it. Okay. So if you're an institution, you require a regulated custodian. That's the end of it. We don't need to have any further discussion on that. However, I would say that even in the US, although I think most institutions that are regulated err on the side of cautiousness, that is still an open issue with regards to the law. That is not a settled issue. There's some stuff pending before the SEC. And in addition to which, 5 or 6 years ago, when these custodians and these custody providers arose, these centralized entities, it totally wasn't an issue. So that's not the reason, even though it may be a reason upcoming now. So what is the reason? Well, the reason is a good one, which is that people needed a solution to key management user experience, as it were. The keys were very complex to manage. They were fraught with risk, as everybody knows, and there were tremendous vulnerabilities associated with them, right? And so you think of it like if you're an individual user, it's complicated already because you have to make decisions on your self-custody solution and how you're going to hold your recovery material. But if you're an institution, it becomes infinitely more complicated because you have a variety of people in user roles. Those user roles may be very nuanced. It's very difficult to control that. And so what people just said is, here, let me give you my keys. You put them in a drawer, and when I don't pick up the phone unless Jim calls, right? And so that was the solution that people went to, and it was meaningful. And I don't mean to diminish it at all. It was absolutely necessary, or no one was going to be able to operate in the space. That being said, it does require trust. It does require someone else holding your keys. It tends to be expensive, non-decentralized, and fraught with risk. And we don't even have to go too far, man. All we have to do is take a look at the news flow for the last month. And what do we've got? We've got Atomic Wallet, we've got Prime Trust, we've got Floating Point Group, we've got multi-chain. These are all supposedly incredibly secure technologies and entities that have basically lost substantial amounts of their customers' funds. And so the ideal, I think, that we should shoot for, and frankly, I think the one that was necessary in order to make the project work, is to actually decentralize and provide sovereignty to users, whether they're individuals or organizations. And that is the specific area that Censo has focused on. And it's a project that we've been working on for the last 2 years.
Very cool. You've been working on this project for 2 years. Basically, you've been part of the end of a bull cycle and the beginning of a bear cycle. So when you guys are talking with institutions, potential clients, just having, informal meetings, how over the past 2 years have the conversations from these institution side entities, how have they changed with the kind of turbulence in the market? Are they undeterred because they've been building for years? Or are they more cautious now after seeing some of the calamities of 2022?
What if I said both? So it's kind of interesting, right? So our user base, include what would be described as institutions, corporate treasurers, hedge funds, things of that nature. Any organization that requires like two or more approvers or key management amongst those people. And then also native Web3 companies. So DAOs, Web3 companies, foundations, treasuries, things of that nature. So I'm going to actually, the latter guys, let's leave alone for this portion of this question. So the question is, how about the outsiders, right? The TradFi guys, as they call them. What happened there? And the truth be told is, my observation is that they found themselves in very fortunate circumstances, because back in the Q4 of 2021, everybody was starting to go to committee, as you do in these traditional firms, to actually get approval to get into crypto. And these organizations move very slowly relative to crypto terms. And so by the time they got through the committee pipeline, crypto was getting decimated. And I think 90% of these guys just said, oh, you know what? That wasn't such a good idea. Let's forget it for now. And all kidding aside, that's kind of what happened. And in a way, I personally think it's kind of a blessing to the crypto ecosystem, because, in the fourth quarter of last year, when we were kind of on the lows in the post FTX situation, I was starting to speak to some of these institutional investors for the first time in a while. And I was expecting, oh man, I was just expecting all sorts of negativity. But the reaction was actually the exact opposite. And it may inform like what's going on with BlackRock now. So I'd go speak to people and they'd be like, they missed the whole thing because they never got out of committee. So most of the crypto natives, they were like, oh, my head hurts, this is terrible. I need to go to a bar again. And the institutional TradFi guys were like, hey, this seems like a good buying opportunity here at Bitcoin 15,000. Right? I mean, it was kind of crazy. And they missed the whole thing. And I think the other thing was, because of the fact that they didn't have active positions, as you and I both know, there was a lot of ugliness in 2022. I mean, the price action was terrible, but like the stories, in some ways, many of them, unfortunately, were worse. And if you're not really invested in the space, you don't follow it that closely, right? And so all these guys, they kind of missed the whole show. They missed the emotional pain. They missed the financial pain. And so I do think that we're coming out of this pretty strong. I still think we have a good distance to go. I think if this BlackRock ETF is approved, and I have no expert insight on that whatsoever, but if it does, I think it's going to cause a renaissance in not immediately jumping into the market, but I think what I'll describe as kind of going back to committee again, like we saw back at the end of 2021. It's surprising, right? It certainly was counterintuitive to what I thought the reaction would be for many of these institutions.
Yeah, I mean, isn't the old adage to buy when there's blood in the streets?
Yeah, exactly. And if you just wake up at that point, it's perfect.
And it's also kind of a gift and a curse that larger scale institutions have a sort of molasses like speed because of the inherent bureaucracy that ties them down. But much like Bitcoin and that being successful for that protocol, how long it takes for something to get through to update it, it could be a feature, not a bug.
Yep.
So something that kind of, I would say, go as far as was a big aha moment for me was when I was discussing with a previous guest that a lot of institutional clients will hold gold as a part of their portfolio, and that you don't necessarily have a pension holding literal gold in a safe at their headquarters, that there's a custodian that provides these solutions, and it's Loomis. You buy the gold, and then Loomis holds and stores it for you and charges a fee. This is going to be similar for digital assets. And the only thing that is different between a commodity like gold, which is physical, and a digital asset is, of course, that it's native on the internet, but you do get to hold your keys, you do get to hold your coins. And that's one of the things that makes this asset class really unique and interesting. And so for the half of your clients that are the institution side, they do need to have this counterparty that they can blame, I guess, or ask to custody those keys. And so this is where Censo steps in. there is a multi-pronged approach that integrates a little bit of decentralization and potentially a little bit of centralization. Maybe this is an opportunity for you to give our listeners like an elevator pitch of what Censo is, and then maybe we can dig into a little bit more of the specifics.
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thanks for the opportunity. So we're a technology provider. Censo is a technology provider, and what we enable is our customers, who are users, who are organizations, to actually be completely sovereign on their keys and their assets, while the technology itself eliminates, as I may have mentioned earlier, all of the complexity and vulnerability of that key management. And what that means is that we have a technology that is actually, I like to say about sovereignty, it's just this is my little hobby horse. There's no such thing as qualifying sovereignty. You're either sovereign or you're not. It's like being somewhat pregnant. There's no such thing. And I think it's the same thing with sovereignty. And so all of our software, which involves all the key handling, the software is all open source, and it is all decentralized as well, which means that the software runs in our clients' own hardware that they own, and they control their keys. No one else can extract the keys. In fact, they can't even extract the keys themselves, but they can use them, which makes it very safe. And those keys speak to policy engines that reside on chain. So on like the Ethereum protocol and the Polygon protocol and the like. And there is a trustless connection between those keys in users' mobile phones that are encrypted with device keys in the phone's HSM, which can't be exfiltrated. And they can sign things and authenticate themselves. And they talk to these contracts, which get deployed on their behalf by our technology, but which once again is under their complete control. They can't be upgraded by us. They can't be tampered by us, and they're fully open source. They're fully open source and audited. And so our users really do have complete sovereignty. But the magic sauce really for us is that normally when you have this sovereignty, as we spoke earlier, is that then you got like this key material and this recovery material, and geez, what do I do with this? This is dangerous in and of itself. And what we've done is we've done some interesting things with cryptography such that everything is seedless. So let's say I were running a hedge fund and I had a couple colleagues, and Dylan, you decided to join the hedge fund and we wanted you to be a signer. You would download the Censo app. There would be a root seed, keys put on your phone. They would be encrypted with, for example, the device keys from our phones, which are in the secure enclave, and exported. No one would actually have any complete set of private material, and none of it is unencrypted. And then if you went out to a bar and you lost your phone and you came in the next day, you said, geez, I didn't back this up with any seed phrase, right? It looked like magic, but now I'm in trouble because I lost my key. We're going to have a bricked company. We can actually reconstitute that by doing a multi-approver transaction and cryptographically reassembling that together. And it goes back on your new phone, identical key, but and encrypted and fully operational again. And so really, this is the piece I believe to have been the missing piece for self-custody, particularly for organizations.
And can you maybe just, since a lot of our audience is this is, and we're not like a technical oriented show where we dig deep into the cryptography and the mathematics behind it and everything, but maybe at a surface level, could you just explain why this is significant, specifically from the point of view that a lot of larger scale enterprise and entities will have multiple individuals that work for the company that are capable of signing off transactions? So could you just maybe share how Censo met that like product market fit, and why it's so important to be able to add and remove users from the ability for a company to have signers on behalf of it?
Yeah. And maybe I could take a step back for 1 second and then attack the question directly on, which is that, aside, as you said, aside from all the cryptography and everything, and, the truth be told is I listen to podcasts as well. I consume them as well. And, you hear these guys talking about, Shamir secret sharing versus like, MPC, TSS, signature generation protocols, and you just want to blow your brains out, right? So really, we should think about these things in very common sense terms. Like, do you have your keys or does someone else have your keys? Are your keys managed with open source software or closed source software? And then finally, in the case of an organization, as you said, okay, does the organization itself have control over the keys and the roles that different people in the organization play, which of course is compliant with how almost every organization runs now, not doing crypto, right? It's like different people have different roles. Or is it like every signer has their own MetaMask and they have their own like private material running around, which of course you couldn't run Goldman Sachs that way, nor should you run any organization that way. And so what we've done with our software within the organization and our solution is to reconcile what I would describe as the nuanced roles that different parties play within the organization and the roles they have as key signers, and making sure that the primacy in the whole relationship is the organization, right? And just to give you a very simple example, if Tim Cook goes down in a plane crash, it's not like they say, hey, we're closing Apple, it's over, the company's over, right? The company is an abstraction that lives through any, what I'll describe as mortality event. I use that in a stylized Fed's way, not like an actual mortality, of any or all the individuals within the organization. But with crypto, traditionally, if you got 6 guys with MetaMasks and they have all their private material and they do go down in a plane crash, you're dead. And so what we did is we've created a system where the organization can persist even in a mortality event of all of the members of the organization. And that's an absolute critical element, and one that really has not been addressed, except, once again, by providers who have centralized solutions that require trust.
And is this system you're talking about called the hierarchical key management system? Okay, cool. So you're nodding along. You're saying yes. So this is something that I think differentiates Censo from a lot of maybe other entities that you're competing against for the same type of clients. So how does maybe like an Eli 5 explain like I'm 5 in a consumable way how hierarchical key management differs from a technical solution like multi-party computation or MPC?
So multi-party computation does have a hierarchical element to it. So you can have nuanced roles, but once again, the cost of that is actually centralization and trust. However, if you don't want to have decentralization and trust, which is the laudable goal, you could use what they call a multi-sig contract. And the most common one known runs on Ethereum. It's called SAFE, formerly Gnosis SAFE. And in a Gnosis SAFE, it has great decentralization, right? And it has great policy engine. And in fact, we use many of those components happily in our solution for our EVM contracts, but it has no key management, which means that if there are 5 signers on a multi-sig contract, they each have their own keys and they are sovereign over those keys themselves. The organization has no, as you would put it, hierarchical control. And what we've done is we've built a system of managing those keys as a group by the organization in mobile devices, such that the organization can have that hierarchical control, where there can be org admins that set policies that affect how those keys can be used and by whom, and importantly, how those privileges can be revoked or replaced by the organization itself. And so it's for the first time bringing that level of key functionality to a fully decentralized organizational element. We've had decentralized organizational element, but there hasn't been any of what we call key management or key abstraction associated with it.
I think that this is the perfect time in the history of technology for a product like Censo to exist. Another thing that kind of stuck out to me for the ease of use of the solution you guys are building is that end users will be using their mobile phone to do biometric confirmation. So could you just also share a little bit more about the role that a mobile phone plays in the Censo ecosystem, and maybe just kind of give a brief overview or an example of what the workflow will look like when someone is indeed performing a transaction on behalf of their company?
So we do use mobile phones. And the reason we use mobile phones is firstly, they are the most secure individual computing device in the world. All the phones that we support have what are called, HSMs, hardware security modules in them, where keys cannot be extracted from those modules, right? So they are ubiquitous and they are incredibly secure. And they can also tie users' identity through biometry to their key signing. These are all absolutely critical and useful elements. And so we have two pieces of our application. We have a web app to be used in a laptop, and that's where transactions are initiated and relayed, for example, to the mobile phone and the on-chain contracts. The on-chain contracts are opaque to customers, and then the phones are used for signing and approving transactions. And what would happen is transaction will be initiated by a member of an organization, depending upon authorizations and approval criteria. Approval notifications will come to the phones. It's an incredibly smooth event. It's like getting your Uber notification. You open up the Censo app. It basically accesses that key. Once again, the key cannot be taken off the phone by the users, by the people who run the organizations. It is on there and can only be accessed by a biometric gating of the secure enclave. And then there are approvals or denials, and then those transactions are relayed to a blockchain. And so all of the activity takes place, all of the activity that requires trust and sensitivity is controlled by the user, either the phones or the contracts. And it's initiate on the web app, approve on the mobile app. And there's no other functionality on the mobile apps as well, because we wanted to ensure that we reduced the attack service on the phones to an absolute minimum. We're very security minded.
Yeah, redundancy through simplicity, or resiliency through simplicity, I should say. So I guess before I ask this next question, would it be fair to say that, or to paint Censo in the picture that though providing custodial solutions for institutional investor like entities, Censo has also prioritized being open source?
Thanks for asking. Our philosophy is all key handling software should be open source, period, full stop. And, the Ledger guys, who I have tremendous respect for, I mean, what they've done in the space for self-custody is just remarkable. You may recall in May, they had this situation where they enabled Ledger Recover. And, they had the poor guys had one of the worst public relations experiences in the history of crypto, and from guys who have done really, really great things. But the one thing is that they have subsequently decided to open source that code base that has to do with that recovery. And my feeling is, had they done that in advance, none of this would have actually happened. And customers, users should absolutely demand that all key handling software is open source. Otherwise, it's just, trust me.
Yeah, more of the same. Thanks for providing that context. So maybe you can share then a little bit of the opportunities and the constraints that have come over the past few years while building this type of solutions for the types of clients you have, because I can imagine that the more high profile, a larger scale enterprise, they might want a little bit of proprietary information on how their assets may or may not be secured. And then also, you guys are making your secret sauce. So you don't want to share everything in open source too quickly. So what was it like, kind of the fine line walking that over the past few years? And again, what were some of the opportunities and constraints?
It's a great question. And, I do think that it's difficult, and we see this time and time again. If you design a business around closed source software, and then for whatever reason you are compelled to open source it, it produces tremendous tension in your business model. Not always, but generally speaking, that's going to be the case, because you've really designed your whole product and business model possibly around the fact that, like, your product couldn't be reverse engineered or something, right? And so you can end up really in a very, very difficult situation, and it's exceedingly painful. But we went back. I mean, I'll tell you, we originally were building an MPC wallet, so multi-party computation. But as we were building it, and we spent quite a bit of time on it, we said, this actually isn't going to cut it, because it's not sufficiently decentralized, and a lot of the code can't be open source. And so after about, I don't know, maybe 8 months of build, we just threw it out and we said, okay, we've got to be committed to this other approach. And once you do that, I think that you can build a product where you say, hey, it's going to work for us commercially, even if it is totally open source. And in fairness, I will highlight that I mentioned that there are two portions of the application that require trust, which is the mobile phone that has the key handling software, and the on-chain smart contracts and policy engines. And those speak to each other trustlessly with only signed transactions, but they are open source. But we also have a Web 2 back end and front end, which is effectively what we describe as a relay server, but it is a relay server with an incredibly rich and beautiful user experience. And that is closed source. I mean, it's a very large application anyway. It doesn't affect the trust of the application at all, because basically it's just those transactions are being encrypted and sent between the keys and all of the guts of the operation. But it's there where we can provide users a really rich experience, and actually use that potentially commercially to our advantage. But that being said, I think we're very, very committed to making sure that nobody has any components that they have to rely upon for trust that aren't open source.
I've had conversations in the past about creating a trust that can manage a 401k or an IRA on behalf of it for whatever reason that the trust wants to manage it. And when it comes to custodial providers, one of the necessary components for these trusts to be able to operate under IRS guidelines is to ensure that there's no unfettered access to the accounts, which essentially means that, let's say the account holder needs to stop moving their assets because they're having a conversation with the law. Unfettered access would mean that the custodial provider could stop the flow of transactions. So let's say the client, the institutional client that you're working with, for some reason, the IRS wants to state that, or another governmental entity wants to state, you cannot access these assets for now. Through Censo, is there a way that there can be like a way to override any transactions or anything like that and provide unfettered access to the assets that are being stored via the Censo solution?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this whole idea of censorship is an interesting one, and where people can get very exercised over it, and understandably so. So, in our case, users could access directly the smart contracts with their keys without going through our relay server if they wanted to. But bear in mind, and look, I shouldn't be in any way compromising my own position. But presumably, at some point, if they were U.S.-based persons and the IRS is chasing you down, I'm sure there are a lot of ways they can make your life miserable as well. But in the case of Censo, there are alternatives to using our relay server, which is also essential. Because as you can think about it, Dylan, we also have to provide for, forget about what if the IRS comes down, what if Censo disappears for whatever reason. Users have to be able to access their assets. So they can do so, though the experience of accessing their assets is a little more cumbersome than if we were up and running, is how I would describe it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you bring that up. The immutability of these assets that we store on chain, we have to have an ego check, particularly when we're running a startup and putting all of our energy and time into it, that sometimes businesses just shutter and people's assets will live forever on chain. So it's really interesting to hear how Censo has addressed this and also provided for alternatives to access this, I guess, information directly on chain. It's really great to hear that a company is thinking about immutability in this way. So I'm kind of curious then, how does Censo go about choosing the chains that you guys work with? I know you mentioned Polygon and Ethereum earlier, but are there other networks that you're also exploring? How do you choose what networks to explore? Do you do internal review yourself, or do you base it off of the conversations you're having with your clients?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of both. And I would say, whatever the zeitgeist might be. So as you're well aware, we rewind the clock a couple of years, the prevailing wisdom was that we were going to have a reasonably substantial number of competing and substantive L1s, and that they all had different flavors. And I think there was a guy from Dragonfly Capital who said you can think of these different blockchains as being different cities with different characteristics and the like. And of course, there's been big debate whether or not that's going to be the case. And you'll have this big horizontal profusion of blockchains with different characteristics with underlying base L1 characteristics, or instead you're going to have a vertical stack on top of obviously Ethereum. And we had actually built on Solana and Bitcoin as well. We had a very big Solana project that we have finished, though we're not releasing it at this time. And it appears, at least for the time being, that the EVM crowd has gotten sufficient gravity that I think that is going to be the ecosystem that we focus on in the near and intermediate term. And so we're launching on Ethereum. We've launched on Ethereum and Polygon. We're going to round out the balance of the substantial EVMs over the course of the coming next few months. And then I think we're going to reassess. But right now, it seems like you had this explosion outwards, and now we have the vacuum sucking everything back in. And, I would say I just returned from ETHCC in Paris last week. And I mean, it's the community is so serious and substantive and like full of toothsome work that's being done. It's really encouraging to see what's going on. So aside from any like pragmatic being a business guy type thing, I think it's really encouraging to be involved with the people in that space.
So that's interesting that you mentioned ETHCC last week. Just armchair quarterbacking. The thing I kind of heard come out of that event was just the prominence of zero knowledge rollups and proofs and products. So I guess to play devil's advocate, because I do appreciate the metaphor you use with the explosion and then everything kind of compounding back into itself. To play devil's advocate, though, let's say that 2017 happens again and 2021 happens again, and these networks get clogged. Do you think that there will be another outward look towards Alt L1s? We saw it happen in 2017 with like Quantum and Neo and Stellar. And then we saw it in 2022 with Solana and Avalanche, yada, yada, yada. You can mention all the ones that you want. You guys have already built for Solana and are opting not to release in that way. So are you guys going to also be paying attention 2-3 years down the road when potentially the EVM ecosystem becomes a bit congested again? Are you guys thinking about being nimble enough to be on your toes to add support for another blockchain, or are you guys just doubling down on providing the most amount of services as you can for EVM chains?
Yeah, well, there you said a couple of interesting things there. Like, so firstly, predicting that far in the future in crypto is crazy, right? I'm just trying to get a grip on what's going on right now. Look, we're reasonably nimble, and we're not we're not philosophical Ethereum warriors, right? So we provide key management, and the keys that we produce in these phones can support any chain, and it's a key management and self-custody services. So we're totally open. I mean, the funny thing is that you said, I think it's just like hilarious to me, is that, you said, am I paying attention? I go, I wish I could pay attention. There's so much stuff that goes on in crypto every day that you come in, it's like, I got to figure out what not to pay attention to so I can get my job done. So I think we're super open to any of that. I mean, for us to enable new support, what we need to do, just technically speaking, is to build a smart contract on that chain that can speak to our phones and then hook in all of like the RPC and other relayer and data layer protocols and stuff. It's actually not that complicated. It's not trivial. We're, resource constrained like everybody else, but it's not that complicated. But if you ask me right now, today, over the next 3 months, whether, what I would do, I'm probably going to just keep building on EVM.
Yeah, it's really funny that you bring that up, that in the blockchain space alone, there have been, in the past few years, so many verticals that have emerged that you have to really focus on one vertical to filter out the signal through the noise. And now we have DeFi, NFTs, GameFi, decentralized identity, roll-ups, so much stuff out there that it's almost impossible to keep up to date with what's going on with everything. So I guess then I'm a little bit curious, what are the ways in which your clients are using blockchain networks and crypto? Are you finding that they want to participate in DeFi? Are they doing DAOs, NFT, just simple custody solutions? What are the ways in which your various different clients, because you mentioned you have some that are TradFi-esque and then very Web3-esque. So
Yep.
what are the ways that you guys have to be nimble to the uses that your clients demand of your custodial solution?
Yeah, so, well, I could put it to you this way. We built out a lot of collectible and NFT capability about 6 to 8 months ago. No one's using that. Particularly given our clientele base, which are like the organizations and the like. For the most part, no one's using that. So that was something that seemed like it was going to be essential. Don't regret rebuild it, I guess, but no one's using that. And so we have a lot of people who really want very secure and simple custody and key management, and actually are very low frequency, but are very happy with the solution. And then also DeFi is a big area, and we enable DeFi pretty seamlessly. We've integrated Wallet Connect into our application. Wallet Connect they just deprecated Wallet Connect 1, and now they're onto Wallet Connect 2. And we actually have a partnership that we recently got into with Consensus, and we will very likely also have MetaMask Institutional available for our customers very shortly as well. Because once again, we really believe in choice for our customers.
Perfect. And I'm not sure whether you can disclose specific names of who your customers and clients are, but maybe could you, if you can't, could you give some examples of the types of clients that they might represent, or the types of brands or industries they might be in?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of them are financial and/or native crypto. And from I think our perspective, our clients generally are not like Goldman Sachs. Like, we really didn't design the product for Goldman Sachs. It could support Goldman Sachs in many ways. It has the integrity, but it's really not designed for that. So they're, what I'll describe as affiliations, organizations, or financial companies that have needs for 2 to 10 signers on custody solutions, who want a, super secure, easy to use self-custody solution. So they're in that sort of small to mid-range type universe is how I would put it.
Perfect. And kind of zooming out before we wrap up, we were mentioning earlier, I'm based out of Denver. One of my favorite conferences every year here is ETH Denver. I personally always feel like there's at least one takeaway that I can come away with from that event. I'm sure you feel similar with ETHCC. For example, with me this year at ETH Denver, it was in March of this year. This was before the SEC hearing, and there was still just a lot of regulatory unclarity. The fear to greed index was quite fear oriented on Bitcoin buying.
Yep.
So I walked away from that event, stayed kind of afraid that there's a brain drain of crypto companies and blockchain companies in the US who are choosing to opt to locate and build outside the States. Now, my thesis is a little bit different than it was in March, but at ETH Denver, that was my main walk away from that event. What would you say was your main walk away from ETHCC, which just happened last week in Paris?
Yeah. So I would say there's probably a couple, but I'm only going to go with one as you requested. So what you really see is, I would say the hardcore infrastructure that is necessary to enable adequate user experience is being built. And I think, technically that would be called account abstraction. And also newly now, for the first time, they're using the term key abstraction, which is really the thing that Censo has been working on for the last 2 years or so, this key abstraction. And these are the things that are going to actually make the user experience, whether you're an organization or an individual, actually acceptable, so we can actually finally have some realistic adoption.
So you felt away feeling like you guys are poised to be in the right place at the right time.
I did. And it's a nice feeling to have, because as a small businessman, you don't always have that opportunity.
Absolutely. So what are some of the next steps for Censo, and what are the types of projects you're interested in hearing from?
The next steps for us are just to build awareness. We have partnerships that we've just recently partnered with. I mentioned Consensus, and also with Chainlink. We're really super excited about both of those partnerships because they're super high quality organizations and they're committed to decentralization. I think stay tuned. We're going to have another couple of announcements of equal importance over the course of the next couple of months. And our goal is to solidify and deepen those relationships where we really feel we have high quality people committed to decentralization, and actually get those ecosystem participants to be utilizing Censo. And we're having some success in that. And I think those are the things that we're really focused on right now.
And what's the best way for people to reach out to you or to reach out to Censo?
I think the easiest way is our website is censo.co. Also, since we do deal with TradFi guys, we are on LinkedIn. We have a prominent presence on LinkedIn, which is embarrassing to admit on a crypto podcast. So my apologies as well. And so I think those are two very reliable ways to get a hold of us.
I'll do a shameless plug. We've been building out our presence on LinkedIn as well for the Smart Economy podcast. So it's nice to know we're in good company. One of the key themes this year that I've been really enjoying having conversations with folks like you who are rubbing elbows with financial institutions is that despite the calamities of 2022, that the institutions have been here, they've been interested, and they've been seeking builders who are creating solutions such as yours. So thank you so much for having this conversation. It just further solidified these great conversations I've been having about the industry that you're building in and for, leveraging and utilizing this technology. So it was great to spend an hour chatting with you, Andrew, and I look forward to keeping up with the great progress that you guys make at Censo.
Dylan, thank you very much. Really a great pleasure both speaking with you and getting to know you. So thank you. It was great.
Cheers. Well, what did you think of that conversation? I thought it was really interesting to dive into the nuances behind how federal intervention was necessary during the financial crisis of 2008, but also the importance of self-sovereignty of our digital assets today. It was also refreshing to hear Andrew touch on the point that their clients' assets might remain on-chain longer than the company is around, and that they've built for their contracts to outlive the company. I also couldn't help but nod my head in agreement when Andrew said, quote, all key handling should be open sourced, end quote, which allows everyone to verify the security of the protocols that they're using to store their assets. On that note, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to listen to the Smart Economy podcast. If you liked what you heard and want to support the show, please keep NEO News Today in mind when voting for your NEO Council representative as part of NEO's governance process. We appreciate you and look forward to catching you next time.